13 years old. That's how young he was when he walked into that courtroom with a smirk that made the entire gallery go silent. While the judge read the charges that should have terrified any child his age, he laughed. He actually laughed, as if the death of his classmate was a joke, as if the grief destroying a family in the front row meant nothing. He believed his age would protect him. He believed the system was too weak to hold him accountable, but he didn't know that the judge sitting above him had already made a decision that would change juvenile justice forever. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability and truth, subscribe right now and tell us in the comments, was what the judge did justice? Let's begin. This is how it all began. 3 months before that courtroom moment, in a quiet neighborhood where families felt safe, where children rode their bikes home as the sun dipped below the trees, there was a boy who seemed ordinary. He went to school. He had parents. He had a life that looked from the outside completely normal. But something was different about him. Something that the adults around him would later admit they had missed, or worse, ignored. On the afternoon of October 15th, a 12-year-old boy named Marcus left school at 3:15, just like he did every day. He texted his mother, "Almost home." Those would be his last words to her. The porch light was on. Dinner was waiting. His mother sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand, watching the minutes pass. At 4 o'clock, she began to worry. At 5, she called the police. What happened in those 45 minutes would shock the entire community. What would happen in the courtroom months later would shock the nation. Because this case wasn't just about a crime. It was about a child who felt nothing, a child who laughed when he should have been terrified, a child who forced the justice system to ask itself an impossible question. At what age does accountability become real? The detectives who found Marcus's body in the drainage culvert 3 days later knew immediately that this was no accident. This was planned. This was deliberate. And the person responsible was someone Marcus had called a friend. The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that happens when a room full of people is holding its breath, waiting for something they know will hurt. The judge sat high above everyone else, his black robe perfectly tailored, his expression already weary from years of carrying other people's pain. The bailiff had just read the charges. Murder. Premeditated murder. The words hung in the air like a stain that wouldn't wash away. And then, from the defense table, came a sound that nobody in that room expected. It was a laugh, not a nervous laugh, not a cry disguised as laughter. It was a real laugh, the kind you make when you find something actually funny. The 13-year-old defendant, sitting between his attorney and a court-appointed social worker, was laughing at the charges that could send him away for the rest of his life. The judge's eyes moved down from the papers in front of him to the boy. There was no anger in that look. There was something worse. There was recognition. The judge had seen this before. A child without remorse, a mind without the weight of conscience that should have been there. But the laughter didn't stop. The boy's shoulders were shaking now. His attorney, a woman named Patricia Kessler, leaned over and whispered something urgently, her hand on his arm, trying to signal that he needed to stop, that the entire courtroom was watching him like he was a specimen under glass. He shrugged. He actually shrugged, as if his lawyer's warning meant nothing. The gallery, packed with reporters, victims' family members, neighbors, and community members who had come to bear witness, began to shift uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others leaned forward, unable to believe what they were seeing. In the second row, directly behind the prosecutor's table, Marcus's mother sat with her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at the boy. She hadn't looked at him since he entered the courtroom. Her eyes were fixed on the wall behind the judge. On nothing. On everything. Her husband sat beside her with his arm around her shoulders, but even he seemed to be in another place, somewhere unreachable. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment the system would acknowledge what had been taken from them. But instead, they were watching their son's killer laugh like they were all characters in a story he found entertaining. The judge made a note, just one line written in careful ink on the legal pad in front of him. Nobody in the courtroom would know what he had written, but that single line would become the foundation of a decision that would echo through the entire juvenile justice system. 3 months before this moment, before the laughter and the judge's careful note, there had been a different sound. The sound of a child's scream that lasted only seconds before it stopped completely. That sound had come from a drainage culvert on the east side of town, hidden from the road by overgrown brush and darkness. When the detectives found Marcus's body 72 hours later, they found more than evidence of a crime. They found evidence of something deliberate. The positioning of the body suggested that whoever did this had taken time, had paused, had made choices about what to do next. The medical examiner would later testify that Marcus had fought back, that he had tried to run. But his injuries told a story of someone who was caught, who was overpowered, who was held there. Not by accident, on purpose. The physical evidence was nearly perfect. Shoe prints in the soil matched a size 5 sneaker, the kind worn by middle school boys everywhere. Fibers from a specific brand of jacket were found on the victim's clothes. Trace DNA was collected, catalogued, and sent to the lab. Within 2 weeks, the result came back with a match to someone in the database. A juvenile with a prior incident report from school. The detectives printed out the photograph and stared at it for a long time. They looked at the face of a 13-year-old boy who went to school with Marcus, who was in his math class, who had been seen walking with him on the day he died. In the interrogation room, when they brought him in and showed him the evidence, he had smiled, not nervously, not in fear. He had smiled like someone who found the whole situation mildly amusing. He denied everything at first, but his lies had been clumsy, contradicted by timestamps and camera footage and his own phone data. Within 4 hours, the detectives had everything they needed. What they didn't have was any sign of guilt in the boy's face. No shame, no tears. Nothing that looked like a conscience struggling to survive the weight of what he had done. That was the moment the detectives knew they were dealing with something unusual, something that scared them more than any adult criminal they had ever interviewed. The judge's pen moved again across his notepad. He was writing something else now, something longer. The boy continued to stare straight ahead. The smile finally fading from his face, replaced by something that looked like boredom. The gallery remained silent. The mother continued to stare at nothing. And somewhere in the building, in a secure holding area, The boy who had laughed at his own charges was beginning to understand that his laughter had been heard by someone who would not forget it. The judge set down his pen. He looked at the defendant one more time. Then he looked at his calendar. The sentencing phase would begin in 6 weeks. Marcus Chen was 12 years old, and he was the kind of child who made parents feel like they had done something right. He wasn't the loudest kid in his class, but he was the one you could trust. He finished his homework without being reminded. He helped his younger sister with her math problems. He remembered his grandmother's birthday. On the afternoon of October 15th, he had left school at 3:15, just like he did every single day. The sun was already starting to lower itself toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made the neighborhood look like a painting someone had left unfinished. Marcus had his backpack slung over one shoulder and his bike helmet hanging from the handlebars of his mountain bike. A blue Specialized that his parents had given him for his birthday just 2 months earlier. He had promised them he would always wear the helmet. He had kept that promise every day since. His route home was one he had ridden hundreds of times. 3 miles through familiar streets, past the park where he sometimes stopped to watch the older kids play basketball, past the corner store where the owner always waved at him, through the residential neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone else's names. It was the kind of route that parents felt comfortable letting their 12-year-old ride, the kind of neighborhood where nothing bad happened. Or at least that's what everyone had believed before that day. Marcus's mother, Susan, was in the kitchen when he left school. She was preparing dinner, his favorite actually, though he didn't know it yet. She was making the stir-fry with the chicken and broccoli that he had mentioned liking 3 weeks ago at dinner. She had remembered. Mothers remember things like that. She had set the table for 4, herself, Marcus's father, Marcus, and his 8-year-old sister, Emma. The house was warm when Marcus texted his mother at 3:47. "Almost home," the message said. Just 2 words. But they were 2 words that meant he was safe, that he was on his way, that dinner would be eaten together as a family just like it was supposed to be. Susan had texted back a simple heart emoji. She had no way of knowing that those would be the last words her son would ever say to her. The porch light was already on, even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. It was a habit in the Chen family. The porch light was always on when someone was coming home. It was a signal, a beacon, a promise that home was waiting, that the door was unlocked, that love was present and ready to welcome you inside. Marcus's father, David, was in his home office upstairs, reviewing files from work. Emma was in the living room, watching a cartoon, waiting for her brother to come home so she could show him the drawing she had made in art class. By 4 o'clock, Susan was beginning to check her phone more frequently. Not worried yet, just noticing. 4:10. Still nothing. At 4:20 she walked to the window and looked out at the street, as if looking hard enough would make her son appear around the corner. The wind was picking up a little, and the leaves were starting to scatter across the sidewalk. She thought about texting him again, but decided against it. He was probably just riding slower, enjoying the weather, taking his time like kids do. At 4:30 she called his phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. The battery must have died, she thought. He was always forgetting to charge his phone completely. David came downstairs and asked if Marcus was home yet. Susan shook her head. They decided to wait another 15 minutes before they called anyone. 15 minutes felt safe. 15 minutes felt like a reasonable amount of time. At 4:45, the dinner was getting cold. Emma kept asking where her brother was. Susan didn't have an answer. David was standing at the front window now, looking out at the street where the porch light was creating a small circle of safety in the growing darkness. At 5 o'clock, they called the police non-emergency line. They gave a description of Marcus. They described his bike. They described what he was wearing, a blue hoodie with a small tear in the left sleeve, jeans, and the blue sneakers he had been saving for 3 months to buy. The operator asked if it was unusual for him to be late. Susan said no. It wasn't. He was always on time. He was a responsible child. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones, in the way her hands had started to shake slightly as she held the phone. By 6 o'clock, David was driving the neighborhood streets, looking down every side road, checking the park, driving past the corner store. By 7 o'clock, the police had put out a missing child alert. By 8 o'clock, the search had expanded to involve volunteers from the community. By 10 o'clock, Susan was sitting on the front step of her house, staring out at the empty street, the porch light still burning, still waiting, still hoping. The bike was found the next morning in a drainage culvert on the east side of town, tangled in brush and partially submerged in water. It was completely empty. No backpack, no helmet, no boy. Just the bike, painted blue and chrome, abandoned in a place where no child should ever have been. The porch light stayed on. It stayed on for 72 hours, until the police came to the house with news that would turn that warm, waiting light into something else entirely. A monument to a child who would never come home again. The body was found on the morning of October 18th, 3 days after Marcus had texted his mother that he was almost home. A jogger had noticed something dark in the drainage culvert, partially hidden by overhanging branches and the way the water had shifted debris over the weeks. The police were called. The area was cordoned off. And then the detectives arrived, and they knew immediately that this was not an accident. This was not a tragic fall. This was something deliberate. The positioning of Marcus's body told a story that made even the most experienced detectives pause. He had been placed with care, not dropped, not abandoned in a panic, but positioned. His body lay face down, arranged in a way that suggested someone had taken time to decide how to leave him. The coroner would later describe it as staging, a term usually reserved for adults, for criminals with experience and intent. But this crime had been committed by someone barely past childhood. The injuries were what told the real story. There were defensive wounds on Marcus's hands and arms, places where he had fought back, where he had tried to protect himself. There were signs of struggle, of a child who had understood in those final moments that something terrible was happening to him. But there were also pauses. The medical examiner found evidence of multiple attacks, separated by what appeared to be moments of time. This wasn't a sudden burst of violence. This was methodical. This was someone who had stopped and then started again. Someone who had made choices about what to do next. The injuries escalated in severity, suggesting that whoever had done this had become more confident as time went on, more certain that they could continue. The detectives exchanged looks. They had seen violence before. They had seen rage. They had seen passion crimes where emotion had overridden reason. But this was different. This had the hallmark of calculation. The crime scene itself was processed with the kind of meticulous care that homicide detectives reserved for their most serious cases. Photographs were taken from every angle. Evidence markers were placed. The ground was carefully excavated to look for any trace of the perpetrator: hair, fibers, skin cells, anything that could tell them who had been here. Shoe prints were found in the soft soil near the body. Small prints, child-sized. Impressions were cast in plaster. The soles of the shoes matched a common brand sold in every mall in America, the kind of sneaker that thousands of middle school students wore. But the size was specific. The tread pattern was specific. The alignment of the prints suggested a gait, a way of walking that could be matched to a suspect. Everything was catalogued. Everything was labeled. Everything was entered into evidence. Fibers from clothing were found on Marcus's body. Blue synthetic material consistent with a common brand of jacket. The color was distinctive. The manufacturer was identifiable. Trace DNA was collected from beneath Marcus's fingernails, suggesting he had scratched his attacker, that he had left pieces of them behind in his attempt to survive. Blood spatter analysis indicated movement patterns. The detectives could reconstruct the moments before Marcus died by reading the blood on the rocks, the debris, the soil. They could see where he had fallen. They could see where he had been dragged. They could see where he had tried to crawl away. The detectives stood in the culvert, looking at the evidence, and they felt something cold move through them. This wasn't the work of a child in a moment of uncontrolled anger. This was the work of someone who understood what they were doing. The medical examiner's preliminary report estimated time of death between 4 and 5 o'clock on October 15th. That was the same window when Marcus had been texting his mother that he was almost home. That was the same time his family was setting the table for dinner. That was the same time the porch light was on, waiting for him. The detectives made note of every detail. They documented the positioning. They recorded the injuries. They noted that there were no signs of sexual assault, but there were signs of something else. Signs of someone who had wanted to hurt, who had wanted to inflict pain, who had understood the difference between an accident and what they were choosing to do. One detective, a woman named Sarah Martinez, who had been doing this work for 19 years, walked back to her car and sat in the driver's seat for several minutes without starting the engine. The shoe prints matched a size 5. That was a child's size. The fibers came from a jacket sold at a chain store that had locations in every neighborhood. The DNA would need to be run against a database to find a match. But the detectives already had a sense of where this was going. They had found Marcus's backpack 200 yards downstream, wedged between rocks. Inside were his homework assignments, his textbook, his pencil case. They had found his phone in the water, waterlogged and destroyed, its battery long since dead. What they hadn't found was any indication that this had been a crime of passion. There was no confession written in the dirt. There was no weapon abandoned in panic. There was nothing that suggested remorse. There was only evidence of method, of planning, of someone who had decided to hurt and had executed that decision methodically. Back at the station, the detectives entered the information into their system. They ran the shoe size against school records. They cross-referenced the fiber analysis with clothing retailers. They began building a profile of the person they were looking for. Then Sarah Martinez's phone rang. It was a call from the school district. One of Marcus's classmates had reported that a school-issued tablet, a device used for educational purposes and tracked with GPS, had pinged near the crime scene at 4:30 on the afternoon of October 15th. The tablet belonged to another student, a student who had been in Marcus's class. A student who, according to the school records, had been absent from fifth period that day. The detectives looked at each other. They already knew before they ran the name, before they pulled the file, before they made the arrest. They already knew that a person who had killed Marcus was someone who should have been sitting in a classroom, learning algebra, thinking about lunch, being a child. The school-issued tablet sat on Detective Sarah Martinez's desk like a small bomb waiting to be detonated. The device was a standard issue, a tablet that the district gave to students for educational purposes, equipped with GPS tracking so that administrators could monitor its location. The detective who had called in the tip explained that the device's location history had been automatically uploaded to the school server before it was powered down. The GPS data showed that the tablet had been within 100 meters of the crime scene at 4:32 on the afternoon of October 15th. The data was precise. The coordinates were exact. The timestamp was irrefutable. Sarah pulled up the map on her computer and zoomed in. There, marked by a red dot, was the drainage culvert where Marcus's body had been found. And there, also marked on the map, was the location of the tablet at the exact moment when the medical examiner estimated Marcus was being attacked. Sarah called the school district immediately. She needed a list of which student the tablet was assigned to. The records administrator found it in the system within minutes. The tablet belonged to a seventh-grade student named Jason Rivers, age 13. Sarah typed his name into the detective database, and a file appeared. There was a prior incident report from 2 years ago, a situation involving animal cruelty that had been handled informally by the school, dismissed as a childhood phase that Jason had grown out of. Sarah made a note of it. She made a note of everything. Then she looked at Jason's photograph in the school system. He was small for his age, with light brown hair and the kind of face that could belong to almost any middle school boy. Nothing about him screamed danger. That was the scariest thing about it. The most dangerous people often don't look dangerous at all. The next step was to request surveillance footage from every camera in the area surrounding the crime scene. Sarah sent officers out to canvass the neighborhood with a specific mission: find footage from any camera, security system, doorbell cam, traffic light camera, anything that might have captured movement near the culvert between 3:30 and 5 o'clock on October 15th. The neighborhood was residential, mostly single-family homes, but there were enough cameras that something might have been caught. A homeowner 2 blocks away had a doorbell camera. A convenience store at the corner had external surveillance. A traffic light at the nearest intersection had been equipped with a camera for accident investigations. Sarah coordinated with each location. The footage was requested. The files were transferred. On the evening of October 18th, Sarah sat in a small room with another detective named Michael Torres, and they began to watch. The doorbell camera footage was time-stamped. They fast-forwarded through the afternoon, watching the empty street, watching the light change, waiting. And then at 4:05, two figures appeared on the screen. Two boys walking together. One was Marcus Chen. They could identify him by his blue hoodie, the same hoodie his mother had described when she filed the missing person report. The other boy was smaller, walking slightly behind Marcus. His head down. Jason Rivers. They were walking together down the residential street, moving in the direction of the culvert. The footage showed Marcus talking, gesturing with his hands, moving like a child who had no idea what was about to happen. Jason was silent, just walking, just following. The camera caught them until they moved out of frame, heading toward the area where the crime had occurred. Sarah and Michael exchanged looks. They continued watching. At 5:32, the footage showed a single figure walking back down the street in the opposite direction. Jason Rivers, alone now, moving quickly, his clothing different somehow, darker, wet perhaps. The sun was lower in the sky. The shadows were longer. He walked past the camera without looking up. He disappeared down the street toward the residential neighborhoods where most of the 7th grade students at Marcus's school lived. Sarah made a note of the timestamp. 5:32. That was when Marcus was no longer alive. That was when Marcus's killers had completed what he had started just over an hour earlier. The metadata on the footage was extracted and verified. The timestamps were checked against multiple sources. The geolocation data from the school tablet was cross-referenced with the camera footage. Everything aligned. The digital breadcrumbs that Jason Rivers had left behind painted a picture so clear that there was no room for doubt or misinterpretation. He had his tablet with him. He had walked to the crime scene with Marcus. He had been present during the time of death, according to the medical examiner's estimates. He had left alone and walked home. The detectives now had motive, means, and opportunity. They had evidence that was digital and physical. They had a timeline that was corroborated by multiple sources. Sarah picked up her phone and called the prosecutor's office. She explained what they had found. She walked through the evidence methodically: the GPS data, the camera footage, the shoe prints, the fibers, the DNA that was being processed. The prosecutor listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, there was a silence on the other end of the line. Then the prosecutor said, "I'll prepare the warrant." Sarah hung up the phone and looked at Jason Rivers' school photograph again. 13 years old. That was how young he was when he had decided to kill his classmate. That was how young he was when he had become a murderer. The paperwork began immediately. The warrant was drafted. The legal language was precise. Everything had to be perfect because this case was going to be unlike anything the juvenile justice system in this county had ever handled before. Jason Rivers was arrested at 7:30 in the morning on October 19th at his home address. The police arrived with the warrant in hand and the understanding that they were taking a 13-year-old into custody for the murder of another 13-year-old. His mother opened the door, confused at first, and then her face changed as the officers explained why they were there. Jason was still in his bedroom, getting ready for school. He was wearing his uniform, the same type of clothes he wore every day to the middle school. When the officers told him he needed to come with them, He didn't resist. He didn't cry. He didn't ask why. He simply put on his shoes and walked to the police car with his hands behind his back as the officers placed handcuffs on his wrists. His mother was screaming behind him, asking what was happening, demanding to know what her son had done. But Jason didn't look back. He stared straight ahead, completely calm, as if being arrested for murder was just another event in his day. The interrogation room was small, with a table bolted to the floor and 4 chairs. The walls were a pale beige color, designed to be neutral, to not distract from conversation. There was a camera in the corner, recording everything. Jason sat on one side of the table, and across from him sat Detective Martinez and Detective Torres. Between them was a file folder containing the evidence, the GPS data, the camera footage, the photographs from the crime scene. An attorney had been called for Jason, but he was a public defender who had just arrived and was still reviewing the case file. Jason had asked if he could speak to the detectives alone, and his attorney had advised against it. But Jason had insisted. He wanted to talk. He was confident. He thought he was smarter than everyone in the room. Detective Martinez began by explaining Jason's rights. She read them from a card, word for word, making sure he understood. Jason nodded along, but there was something in his expression that suggested he wasn't really listening, that he already knew what she was going to say and found it boring. She explained that anything he said could be used against him in court. She explained that he had the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. She explained that if he confessed, that confession would be admissible in a court of law. Jason smiled when she said the word confessed. Just a slight smile, but it was there. Martinez asked him if he understood his rights. Jason said yes, he understood. Then she asked him directly, "Did you kill Marcus Chen?" Jason's response was immediate. "No," he said. "I had nothing to do with it." His tone was light, almost casual, as if someone had asked him if he had stolen a cookie from the jar. Detective Torres opened the file folder and slid the doorbell camera footage across the table. It showed Jason and Marcus walking together toward the culvert. Torres asked Jason to explain the footage. Jason looked at it for a moment and then shrugged. "We were just walking," he said. "That doesn't prove anything." Torres asked where they were walking to. Jason said he couldn't remember. Marcus wanted to show him something near the park, maybe. His story was already unraveling, and he had only been in the room for 5 minutes. Torres then showed him the GPS data from the tablet. The red dot marked Jason's location at the crime scene during the time of the murder. Jason looked at the map and said the data must be wrong. The tablet was probably broken. Torres asked him if he had brought the tablet with him that day. Jason said no. Then he said maybe. Then he said he couldn't remember. The detectives watched as Jason's confidence began to crack slightly, but not because he was afraid. It was clear that he was simply realizing that he had underestimated how much evidence they had. He had thought he was smarter than them. He had thought that without a confession, without a weapon, without an eyewitness, they wouldn't be able to prove anything. He was discovering that he was wrong. Detective Martinez leaned forward and asked him directly, "Jason, what happens if you don't talk to us? What happens if you refuse to answer our questions?" Jason straightened up in his chair. His attorney would later testify that this was the moment she realized how unusual this child was. A normal 13-year-old would have been terrified. A normal 13-year-old would have asked for their parents. But Jason simply asked a question back. "Can you charge me as an adult?" Martinez said that the prosecutor would make that decision. She explained that he was currently being interviewed as a juvenile, that juvenile court had different rules than adult court, that there were protections in place for children his age. Jason processed this information, and then he began to smile again. What happened over the next 2 hours was a masterclass in guilty behavior. Jason's lies became more elaborate even as the evidence against him became more overwhelming. He constructed alternative explanations for every piece of evidence. The fibers from his jacket? He said he had never worn that jacket. The shoe prints? He said hundreds of kids wore the same brand of shoes. The DNA under Marcus's fingernails? He said he didn't know how that got there. Maybe they had played together at school. But his explanations didn't hold up. They contradicted each other. He made statements that directly conflicted with the video evidence the detectives showed him. The detectives didn't accuse him. They didn't raise their voices. They simply presented the evidence, piece by piece, and asked him to explain. Each explanation was worse than the last. Each lie was more transparent. At one point, Detective Torres asked Jason if he had wanted to hurt Marcus. Jason's response was immediate and chilling in its matter-of-factness. "No," he said, "I didn't want to hurt him. I did hurt him." It was a distinction that seemed important to Jason, as if there was a moral difference between intention and action, between planning and execution. The detectives exchanged looks. They had been doing this long enough to recognize something unusual in Jason's responses. He wasn't showing remorse. He wasn't showing fear. He was showing something else, a kind of detached curiosity about the whole process, like a scientist observing an experiment. The interrogation continued for another hour. Jason's attorney finally insisted that they stop. Jason had said enough, but as the officers were leading him out of the room, back to the holding area, he turned and looked at the camera in the corner of the room. He smiled, and then he laughed. It was a laugh that would later be played in the judge's chambers, a laugh that would be analyzed by psychologists, a laugh that would haunt the detectives who heard it. The phone extraction was completed within 48 hours. Jason's cellular device was a standard smartphone, the kind that millions of teenagers carried in their pockets. It contained the usual things: social media apps, games, messaging platforms. But it also contained something else. It contained a digital record of Jason's thoughts, his emotions, his intentions. The forensic technician downloaded the data, and what emerged from that data was a pattern so clear that the prosecutor had to read it twice to make sure she wasn't misunderstanding. The text messages spanned back months. They showed a relationship between Jason and Marcus that was far more complex than the simple friendship that most people had assumed. They showed resentment. They showed jealousy. They showed something that looked remarkably like premeditation. The messages began in August, shortly after school had started. Marcus had been selected for the advanced academic track, a program for students who performed well on standardized tests. Jason had not been selected. The text messages showed Jason asking Marcus why he got in and why Jason didn't. The tone was light at first, playful almost. But over the course of several weeks, the messages changed. They became more pointed. Marcus had started hanging out with other kids in the advanced program, kids from wealthier families, kids whose parents were doctors and lawyers and business owners. Jason's messages reflected a growing sense that he had been left behind, that Marcus had abandoned their friendship for something better. One message said, "I guess I'm not smart enough for you anymore." Another said, "You think you're so special now?" The messages weren't threatening. They weren't explicitly violent, but they painted a picture of someone whose resentment was growing, whose sense of rejection was deepening, whose anger was being carefully stored away like money in a bank account. What made the prosecutor's blood run cold were the messages from October 15th, the day of the murder. Jason had texted Marcus that afternoon, asking him to meet him near the park. The message was casual. "Hey, want to check out that trail by the culvert? I found something cool there." Marcus had responded within minutes. "Sure, I can go for like 30 mins. Have to get home for dinner." That was the message that led Marcus to his death. The detectives traced the digital exchange. They confirmed the times. They verified that these messages had been sent from Jason's phone to Marcus's phone. The prosecutor read those messages and felt something shift inside her. A child had deliberately lured another child to a location where he intended to hurt him. The evidence was digital. The evidence was undeniable. But it was what happened after the murder that truly shocked everyone. 3 hours after Marcus's estimated time of death, Jason had sent a text to a friend named David. The message was a photo of himself, taken in a mirror. In the photo, Jason was smiling. Behind him, partially visible, was what looked like fresh scratches on his arm. The message below the photo said, "Got into a fight, lol." That was all. Just those 3 words and a photograph. An hour later, another text arrived on Jason's phone from his girlfriend. Yes, at 13, he had a girlfriend. She asked him if he was okay, if the scratches hurt. Jason responded with a series of emojis, not sad faces, not concerned emojis. He used laughing emojis, skull emojis, fire emojis, the kind of emojis that teenage boys use when they think something is funny, when they think something is cool. The girlfriend had no idea that those scratches had come from Marcus fighting for his life. She had no idea that the fight Jason was joking about had ended with her friend lying dead in a drainage culvert. The prosecutor made copies of all the messages. She printed them out and laid them on her desk in chronological order. She read them again and again, trying to understand the mind that had produced them. The messages showed no grief. They showed no confusion. They showed no uncertainty about what had happened or what Jason had done. What they showed was someone who was proud of himself. Someone who thought what he had done was amusing. Someone who had deliberately lured his victim, had executed his plan, and had then joked about it to his friends as if it was just another day. The prosecutor had been handling cases for 15 years. She had seen adults commit terrible crimes, but this was different. This was a child. A 13-year-old boy who had orchestrated a murder and then celebrated it with emojis. The defense attorney received copies of the messages on the morning of October 22nd. She read them in her office with her assistant, and neither of them spoke for several minutes after finishing. There was no defense for messages like these. There was no explanation that would make them seem innocent or misunderstood. The only argument that remained was the legal one, that Jason was a child, that his brain was still developing, that there were mitigating factors related to his age. But even as she prepared those arguments, she knew how they would sound in front of a judge. They would sound like excuses. They would sound like someone trying to protect a child who clearly did not want protecting, who clearly felt no remorse, who clearly understood exactly what he had done and felt no regret whatsoever. On October 23rd, the evidence box was sealed and transported to the prosecutor's office. Inside were the photographs from the crime scene, the shoe impressions, the fiber analysis, the DNA results, the medical examiner's report, the camera footage, and the GPS data. A separate file contained the digital evidence, the text messages, the phone records, the metadata. Everything was logged and cataloged. Everything was cross-referenced and verified. The case was solid. There were no gaps. There were no reasonable doubts. What there was, instead, was a complete and undeniable record of a child who had killed another child, and then had laughed about it. The prosecutor held the evidence file in her hands and made a decision. She would recommend that Jason Rivers be charged as an adult. She would push for the maximum sentence allowed by law, and she would make sure that every single piece of evidence was presented in the courtroom so that everyone would understand exactly who they were dealing with. Jason Rivers' parents sat in their living room on the evening of October 23rd, and they were still trying to understand how their son had become a murderer. His mother, Catherine, had called her sister repeatedly throughout the day, asking the same questions over and over. How had they missed this? How had they not seen it coming? She described Jason to the investigative social worker as a quiet boy, someone who kept to himself, who didn't have many friends, who spent a lot of time alone in his room. She said he was polite to adults. He did his chores without complaining. He got decent grades. She said she had no idea he was capable of this. His father, Michael, was more defensive. He said that Jason was just a normal kid who had gotten in with the wrong crowd, that something had triggered him, that this wasn't the real Jason. But the evidence told a different story. The social worker who visited the home found a bedroom that was meticulously organized, filled with books about psychology and criminal cases. There were notes Jason had written, observations about human behavior, speculations about what made people commit crimes. The social worker photographed everything and made detailed notes. The school records told a story that the parents either hadn't understood or had chosen to ignore. There was an incident report from 4th grade. Jason had been caught torturing a bird in the school courtyard. The report said that he had trapped the bird and was slowly pulling out its feathers. When teachers intervened, Jason had been calm. He had explained that he was curious about how the bird would react. He had felt no empathy for the animal, no distress at what he had done. The incident had been handled informally. The parents had been called, but there had been no serious consequence. The school counselor had recommended that Jason receive some counseling, but the parents had declined. They said it was just a phase. They said Jason was a sensitive boy who didn't understand his own strength. They said he was sorry, even though the incident report noted that Jason had not appeared sorry at all. There was another incident in 6th grade. A girl in Jason's class had accused him of spreading rumors about her, of deliberately spreading false information in order to damage her reputation with her friends. The school had investigated. The evidence showed that Jason had created a fake social media account and had posted messages pretending to be the girl, making her look bad, making her look cruel. When confronted, Jason had explained that it was a joke. It was a prank. Everyone was overreacting. The girl had cried. She had considered hurting herself. Her parents had been furious. But again, the consequences had been minimal. Jason had been made to apologize. He had been required to take down the posts. His parents had expressed their disappointment, but they hadn't seemed to understand the severity of what he had done. They had framed it as a mistake, something that all kids did, something that Jason would grow out of. The teachers who had documented these incidents exchanged looks when the detective came to interview them. They had seen the pattern, they had documented it, but they had also operated within a system that didn't take these warning signs seriously enough when they involved children. The detective interviewed Jason's 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who had retired 2 years earlier. Mrs. Patterson remembered Jason clearly. She remembered that he was a child who could manipulate situations to his advantage. He could make other children do things for him by understanding exactly what they wanted and offering it to them. He could turn friends against each other by telling each of them something different. He understood social dynamics in a way that was unusual for an 8-year-old. She remembered feeling uncomfortable around him sometimes, though she hadn't quite been able to articulate why. He would smile and be polite, and then she would realize that he had just convinced another student to take the blame for something he had done. She had tried to address it with his parents, but they had dismissed her concerns. They said Jason was just smart, that he understood how to navigate social situations, that this was a sign of intelligence and maturity. What they had missed was that Jason was using that intelligence not to build relationships, but to manipulate them. He was not maturing. He was perfecting the art of exploitation. The pattern, once documented by the detectives and the social worker, was undeniable. It started in early childhood with a lack of empathy toward animals. It progressed to deliberate cruelty in middle childhood. It evolved into psychological manipulation in late childhood. By the time Jason was 13, he had developed a sophisticated understanding of how to hurt people without leaving obvious evidence, how to exploit their emotions, how to make them feel responsible for his actions. What made it worse was that none of this had required professional intervention. None of this had required a psychiatric diagnosis. Jason was not insane. He was not psychotic. He was not suffering from a treatable mental illness. He was simply a child who had no capacity for empathy and who had learned that he could do whatever he wanted as long as he was smart enough to cover his tracks. The detective made note of all of this. She added it to the file. She understood that this information would be important in the courtroom, not as an excuse, but as an explanation of how a child could become capable of murder. Catherine Rivers continued to maintain that her son was a good boy who had made a terrible mistake. Michael Rivers continued to insist that something external had caused this, that Jason had been corrupted by something or someone else. Neither of them seemed capable of accepting the truth that the evidence was presenting, that they had raised a child without a conscience, and they had failed to recognize it or address it when there might have been intervention possible. The social worker listened to their explanations and then left the home with boxes of evidence and the understanding that she had just witnessed the denial of two parents who had failed to see the monster they were raising. The caseworker submitted her report to the prosecutor, who added it to the growing mountain of evidence that would be presented in court. On October 25th, the prosecutor's office issued a notice. Jason Rivers would be charged as an adult. He would face charges of premeditated murder. A trial date was set for January 15th. The judge assigned to the case was the Honorable William Richardson, a man with 23 years of experience on the bench and a reputation for being fair but uncompromising when it came to serious crimes. The news was released to the media. The headlines appeared in every newspaper in the state. A 13-year-old had been charged with the murder of another 13-year-old. The case had captured the attention of legal experts, child psychologists, and the general public. Everyone was waiting to see how the judge would handle a case that challenged everything the juvenile justice system was designed to protect. The court date was marked on calendars. The waiting period began, and in his holding cell, Jason Rivers sat and waited, with absolutely no apparent concern about what was coming. The first appearance before Judge William Richardson took place on October 26th in the Juvenile Court Division of the county courthouse. Jason was transported in a secure vehicle, handcuffed to a chain around his waist, flanked by two correctional officers who had been briefed about his case. The courtroom was smaller than the one where his eventual trial would take place, more intimate in some ways, though no less formal. The judge sat at his elevated bench, reviewing the case file that had been prepared for him. The prosecutor was present. The defense attorney was present. Jason's parents sat in the gallery, looking shell-shocked, as if they still couldn't quite believe they were in a courthouse. The bailiff called the court to order. The judge looked up from his papers and studied Jason for a moment before speaking. His expression was unreadable. He was a man in his late 50s with gray hair and the kind of face that had heard too many excuses and seen too much suffering to be easily moved. The bailiff read the charges: murder in the first degree. Premeditated murder. The charges were read in a formal voice that echoed slightly in the small courtroom. The gravity of the words seemed to hang in the air. This was not a juvenile offense. This was not a case of bullying or vandalism or shoplifting. This was a murder charge. The maximum penalty for an adult convicted of premeditated murder in this state was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Jason was 13 years old. The implication was clear. If he was found guilty, he could spend the rest of his life in prison. The bailiff finished reading the charges and turned to Jason. He asked Jason if he understood the charges being read against him. Jason nodded. The judge asked him to speak out loud. Jason said yes, he understood. His voice was steady. There was no tremor in it. There was no indication that he grasped the magnitude of what was happening. That was when Jason smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a smile that suggested fear or anxiety, or the normal emotional response of a 13-year-old facing murder charges. It was a smile that looked almost amused. It was the same smile he had worn in the interrogation room, the same smile that had been captured on the doorbell camera footage as he walked home from the crime scene. The judge's eyes moved to Jason's face, and something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. The judge leaned forward slightly. He was studying Jason with an intensity that suggested he was looking for something specific, trying to confirm something he suspected. The prosecutor, who was sitting at the prosecution table, had also noticed the smile. She made a small note in her file. The defense attorney, sitting beside Jason, felt a flutter of something that might have been panic. She understood what was happening. The judge was seeing Jason clearly now. The judge asked Jason to stand. This was a formal proceeding, even in juvenile court, and there were rituals that had to be observed. Jason stood. He was small for his age, only about 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a frame that looked almost fragile compared to the officers standing beside him. He stood with his hands cuffed in front of him, the chain around his waist making it impossible for him to move quickly or suddenly. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. There was a silence that stretched, that seemed to expand, that filled the space between the judge and the boy standing before him. The judge did not speak immediately. He simply looked at Jason. He looked at the smile. He looked at the eyes that showed no fear, no remorse, no understanding of the situation. He looked at a child who appeared to be completely unaffected by the fact that he had murdered another child. When the judge finally spoke, it was not to read a ruling or to set a trial date. Those things would come later. What the judge said was simple. What the judge said was 7 words that would be repeated in newspapers and discussed in legal journals for years to come. The judge looked directly at Jason Rivers and said, "I see you." That was all. Just those 4 words, spoken with a tone that suggested the judge understood exactly who he was looking at. He understood that this was not a normal child who had made a terrible mistake. He understood that he was looking at someone who was fundamentally different, someone without the emotional apparatus that normally prevented humans from harming each other. The judge's voice carried no anger. It carried no judgment in the emotional sense. It simply carried recognition. It carried the clear acknowledgement that the mask had been seen through, that the pretense of being a normal teenager had been pierced, that the judge understood what Jason was. Jason's smile faltered for just a moment, just a fraction of a second. It was the first sign of any emotion breaking through his calm exterior. The judge had said something that got under his skin, not because it was an insult, but because it was a recognition of truth. It was a statement that the judge saw through Jason's carefully constructed presentation. The judge knew what he was. And in that moment, Jason realized that his intelligence, his careful manipulation, his ability to lie convincingly, none of it was going to work with this judge. The judge had already seen inside him. The judge had already understood what he was. The defense attorney touched Jason's arm gently, signaling him to sit back down. Jason sat. The smile was gone now, replaced by an expression of cold calculation, as if he was reassessing his situation, determining if there was a new strategy he needed to employ. The judge announced that the trial would commence on January 15th. He set bail conditions. Jason would remain in secure detention pending trial. The judge made note that this was a case involving serious crimes and serious questions about whether the juvenile justice system was equipped to handle it. He stated that he would be reviewing all available evidence before the trial began. He stated that he would be considering whether the defendant should be prosecuted as an adult in the criminal court system rather than handled through the juvenile system. Those words sent a ripple through the courtroom. The prosecution sat back, satisfied. The defense attorney began taking notes frantically. Jason's parents exchanged looks. The bailiff began to stand, preparing to escort Jason back to the secure holding area. Before Jason was led away, the judge struck his gavel once. Not the traditional 3 strikes that marked the end of a session, but a single strike. A single, deliberate sound that seemed to echo in the small courtroom. It was a sound that suggested finality. It was a sound that suggested that the judge had made a decision, that the outcome of this case had already been determined in his mind, that what would follow in the courtroom over the next months would be the formal process of proving what he already knew. Jason was led away, still showing no emotion, still showing no understanding that everything had changed in those 7 words. The judge had seen him, and now the judge would make sure that everyone else saw him too. The legal experts began to appear on television almost immediately after Jason's first court appearance. They came from universities and law firms, and they all seemed to agree on one fundamental point. This case was unprecedented in the state's history. Never before had a 13-year-old been charged as an adult for a crime committed at such a young age. The legal argument centered on a simple question. Could a child be held criminally responsible in the same way that an adult could be held responsible? The defense began to prepare their argument, and it was an argument that had been successful many times before in cases involving juveniles. The defense would argue that Jason's brain was still developing, that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, consequence evaluation, and moral reasoning, was not fully formed in a 13-year-old. The defense would argue that Jason was not capable of understanding the full consequences of his actions. The defense would argue that the juvenile justice system existed precisely for cases like this, to rehabilitate young offenders and give them a chance at redemption. The prosecutor, however, had a different argument to make. She had the text messages. She had the deliberate planning. She had the evidence that Jason had specifically lured Marcus to the location where he intended to hurt him. She had the medical examiner's testimony that the attack showed signs of calculation and intent. She had the interrogation video where Jason had lied repeatedly and showed no sign of remorse. The prosecutor's argument was that Jason Rivers understood exactly what he was doing. He understood that killing was wrong. He understood the consequences. He simply didn't care. She argued that the purpose of the juvenile justice system, rehabilitation, could not apply to someone who showed absolutely no capacity for remorse or change. She argued that Jason Rivers was not a child who had made a mistake. He was a person who had committed a calculated murder. She argued that he should be tried as an adult, prosecuted under adult criminal law, and sentenced under adult sentencing guidelines. The 2 arguments stood in direct opposition to each other. The public had begun to form opinions almost immediately. The case was covered in every newspaper, on every television news program, in every social media feed. Marcus's family had given one interview, And in that interview, his mother had spoken about her son. She had talked about his kindness, his intelligence, his dreams for the future. She had talked about the porch light that was no longer necessary because the child it was meant to welcome home would never come home again. The public had responded with outrage. They wanted justice. They wanted accountability. They wanted a system that would not let a killer hide behind the label of juvenile offender and expect to walk free in a few years. Online petitions began to circulate, demanding that Jason Rivers be tried as an adult. News anchors asked legal experts if there was any way the system could protect society from a child like Jason. The experts explained the limitations of juvenile court. They explained that the maximum sentence in juvenile court was typically to be held until the age of 21. They explained that Jason could potentially be released before his 30th birthday. The public was horrified. The victim's family sat in their living room and watched the news coverage. Marcus's father had requested that his family's identity be somewhat protected, but that protection was limited. Everyone in the community knew who they were. Everyone in the community knew what they had lost. Susan, Marcus's mother, had written a letter to the judge. In the letter, she described finding the porch light still burning after her son had been missing for 3 days. She described the moment the police had come to her door with the news that Marcus had been found. She described the autopsy report. She described having to identify her son's body. She described a pain so profound that she couldn't imagine living with it. She described rage. She described a mother's desperate need for the system to do something meaningful, to ensure that the person who had taken her son from her would not simply walk free one day as if nothing had happened. The letter was submitted to the judge. The judge read it carefully. He made notes. The defense team scrambled to prepare their case. They hired expert witnesses, child psychologists, neurologists, developmental specialists. They began to build a narrative that would explain Jason's behavior in terms of brain development, in terms of environmental factors, in terms of mitigating circumstances. But there was a problem with their strategy. The more evidence they examined, the more they understood that the mitigating factors were not what they had hoped for. Jason came from a stable home. He had parents who cared about him, even if they had failed to recognize the danger signs. He was not abused. He was not neglected. He was not suffering from untreated mental illness. The standard defense arguments simply did not apply. What the defense found instead was a child who had shown a progressive pattern of cruelty, manipulation, and disregard for others. What the defense found was a child who had understood the consequences of his actions and had chosen to commit murder anyway. The defense team had to get creative. They had to find arguments that went beyond the standard juvenile justice framework. Judge Richardson issued an order. He would allow a full evidentiary hearing before the trial began. During this hearing, both the prosecution and the defense would present evidence designed to answer a fundamental question. Should Jason Rivers be tried as an adult in criminal court, or should he remain in the juvenile system? This was not a trial. It was a legal proceeding designed to determine which system would handle his case. The prosecution would present evidence of Jason's planning, his understanding, his sophistication. The defense would present evidence of his age, his development, his potential for rehabilitation. The judge would listen to both sides, review all evidence, and make a decision that could set precedent for how the state handled similar cases in the future. The hearing was scheduled to begin on December 15th, 6 weeks after Jason's first court appearance. 6 weeks for the prosecution to organize their evidence. 6 weeks for the defense to prepare their arguments. 6 weeks of waiting, of anticipation, of a community holding its breath. The courtroom was being prepared. Prosecutors were organizing their evidence into a presentation that would make sense to the judge, that would tell the story of a calculated murder. Evidence boxes were being arranged. Photographs were being prepared for display. Video footage was being digitized and edited into a timeline that would be easy to follow. The doorbell camera footage that showed Jason and Marcus walking together toward the culvert was being prepared for projection on a large screen. The text messages were being printed out and organized in chronological order. The GPS data was being converted into maps that would show exactly where Jason had been at every moment during the time of the murder. The medical examiner was preparing her testimony. The detectives were reviewing their notes. Everything was being arranged with meticulous care because this presentation had to be perfect. In his chambers, Judge Richardson sat at his desk and reviewed the case file. He read the text messages. He watched the interrogation video. He studied the crime scene photographs. He reviewed the medical examiner's report. He read the school records, the incident reports, the social worker's assessment. He understood what he was looking at. He understood that this case was going to force him to make a decision that would be difficult, that would be controversial, that would have implications far beyond Jason Rivers. He understood that the eyes of the entire state were on him. He understood that whatever he decided would be debated, challenged, appealed, and analyzed. He made more notes. He thought about Marcus Chen. He thought about the porch light that had stayed on. He thought about a mother who would never see her son come home. And he began to formulate the framework for a decision that was already becoming clear in his mind. The evidentiary hearing began on December 15th in a courtroom that was significantly larger than the juvenile court where Jason had made his first appearance. This was the adult criminal court, a space designed to handle serious felonies, a space with higher ceilings and more seats for observers. The gallery was packed. Reporters sat in the media section, notebooks open, cameras ready. Victim advocates sat behind the prosecution table. Members of the community sat in the public seating area. Every seat was filled. The only empty spaces were the ones intentionally left empty, the spaces where additional court personnel stood, where bailiffs positioned themselves, where the formality of the criminal justice system was on full display. Judge Richardson entered from his chambers, and everyone stood. He took his seat, and the proceeding began. The prosecutor stood and announced that she would be presenting evidence regarding Jason Rivers' fitness for trial in adult criminal court. She would show, through that evidence, that Jason Rivers understood the nature and consequences of his actions and that he was therefore capable of being tried as an adult. The first piece of evidence presented was the surveillance footage from the doorbell camera. The prosecutor queued up the video on the large screen that had been installed in the courtroom. She spoke as the footage played, narrating what everyone was seeing. At 4:05 in the afternoon on October 15th, two boys appear on this camera walking together down Maple Street, she said. The boy in the blue hoodie is Marcus Chen, the victim. The boy behind him is the defendant, Jason Rivers. The courtroom watched as the two boys walked toward the culvert. Marcus was talking, gesturing with his hands, completely unaware. Jason was quiet, walking with purpose. His face set in an expression of calm concentration. There was nothing in his expression that suggested he was about to commit murder. There was nothing that suggested anything was wrong at all. He looked like a normal 13-year-old boy taking a walk with a friend. The prosecutor paused the video. "Notice the defendant's demeanor," she said. "He is calm. He is collected. He knows exactly where he is going and what he is about to do." The video resumed. The two boys walked out of frame, heading toward the area where the crime would be committed. The prosecutor allowed the silence to sit for a moment. Everyone in the courtroom understood what was happening in those moments that were not captured on camera. The prosecutor then presented the next piece of evidence, a detailed timeline constructed from GPS data, medical examiner findings, and additional surveillance footage from nearby traffic cameras. The timeline showed Marcus's movements that afternoon, his departure from school, his ride toward home, his detour when Jason had asked him to meet. The timeline showed the exact 47-minute window when Jason had been present at the crime scene, according to the GPS data from the school tablet. The timeline showed Jason's departure from the crime scene at 5:32, walking home alone, walking away from Marcus, leaving him behind in the culvert. The prosecutor then played the second piece of surveillance footage from the traffic camera at the corner of Maple Street and Fifth Avenue. The camera had a view of the street as it approached the residential neighborhood. At 5:32 and 14 seconds, a single figure appeared on the camera, walking quickly away from the direction of the culvert. It was Jason Rivers. His clothes were darker than they had been in the earlier footage. There appeared to be something wet on his jacket. His pace was quick, purposeful. He walked past the camera and disappeared down the street toward his neighborhood. The prosecutor paused the video. "At this time," she said, "Marcus Chen was no longer alive. The defendant has just walked away from the crime scene. Notice his demeanor. He is not running. He is not panicking. He is walking calmly, as if he has just completed a task and is ready to move on to the next part of his day." The courtroom was silent. The judge was taking notes, his pen moving carefully across his legal pad. The prosecutor then presented the crime scene reconstruction. Using computer graphics and the medical examiner's testimony, she showed the jury. Yes, a jury had been impaneled for this hearing, as it was now a criminal proceeding, exactly what had happened in those 47 minutes. The graphics showed Marcus arriving at the culvert. The graphics showed a second figure approaching him. The graphics showed the moment when violence began. The graphics did not show explicit gore or graphic violence, but they showed movement, positioning, intent. The graphics showed Jason circling back, attacking again, pausing, then attacking once more. The graphics showed a pattern of violence that suggested someone who was making choices, who was deciding when to continue and when to pause. The graphics showed murder, but they showed it in the language of legal reconstruction rather than in the language of explicit brutality. As the prosecution presented this evidence, Jason sat at the defense table, and for the first time, something in his expression changed. His calm exterior began to crack slightly. Not dramatically, not with tears or visible emotion, but something shifted. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been resting casually on the table in front of him, balled into fists. His eyes, which had been wandering around the courtroom with detached curiosity, now fixed on the screen where his own actions were being reconstructed, displayed for everyone to see. The defense attorney noticed the change and touched his arm, but Jason didn't respond. He was focused entirely on the screen, on the evidence, on the undeniable proof of what he had done. For the first time since his arrest, Jason Rivers was confronted with the reality of his actions displayed in front of him, unavoidable and irrefutable. The prosecutor continued her presentation, moving through the physical evidence. She presented the shoe prints that matched Jason's sneakers. She presented the fibers from his jacket found on Marcus's body. She presented the DNA results showing Jason's DNA under Marcus's fingernails. She presented the text messages showing the planning, the luring of Marcus to the location, the aftermath celebration with emojis. With each piece of evidence, the prosecutor was building a narrative so complete, so detailed, so undeniable that there was no room for reasonable doubt, no space for alternative explanations. She was proving methodically and carefully that Jason Rivers had understood exactly what he was doing, that he had planned it, that he had executed it, and that he had felt no remorse afterward. The courtroom listened. The judge listened. Jason listened. And something in Jason's expression suggested that he finally understood that his intelligence was not going to save him, that his lies were not going to work, that the system had seen through everything he had tried to hide. The defense attorney stood to cross-examine the prosecutor's witnesses, to challenge the evidence, to present alternative interpretations. But there was no alternative interpretation that made sense. The evidence was too complete. The timeline was too precise. The forensic data was too specific. The defense attorney did her job. She asked questions. She challenged assumptions. She tried to plant seeds of doubt. But everyone in the courtroom could see that she was fighting a losing battle. The evidence was overwhelming. The case was solid. By the time the prosecution rested, the outcome of the hearing had already been determined. Judge Richardson had seen what he needed to see. Jason Rivers had understood what he was doing. Jason Rivers was capable of being tried as an adult. The prosecution's final witness in the evidentiary hearing was Dr. Patricia Walsh, a forensic psychologist who had spent 23 years studying juveniles who committed serious crimes. She had reviewed Jason's case file extensively. She had conducted a psychological evaluation of Jason in the detention facility. She had reviewed his school records, his medical history, his family history, and all available evidence regarding his behavior over his 13 years of life. When she took the stand, she carried with her a report that was over 100 pages long. The prosecutor asked her to summarize her findings. Dr. Walsh began by explaining a concept that would become central to understanding Jason Rivers, callous unemotional traits, or CU traits, as they were abbreviated in psychological literature. These traits referred to a persistent pattern of behavior characterized by a lack of empathy, a lack of guilt, a lack of remorse, and an inability to form genuine emotional connections with other people. Dr. Walsh explained that most children, even children who commit crimes, experience some level of guilt or shame when confronted with the harm they have caused. Most children show signs of distress when they are separated from their parents, when they are imprisoned, when they face the consequences of their actions. But there are some children, a small percentage of the population, who do not experience these emotions in any meaningful way. These children can appear to feel guilt. They can mimic the expressions of remorse. They can say the words that are expected of them. But underneath the surface there is an absence, an emptiness, a fundamental lack of the emotional apparatus that normally prevents humans from harming each other. Jason Rivers, Dr. Walsh testified, showed every indicator of being one of these children. His psychological evaluation revealed no signs of guilt, no signs of shame, no signs of genuine remorse. When asked about Marcus's death, Jason had displayed what Dr. Walsh called superficial sadness, the kind of sadness that looked appropriate on the surface but lacked any real emotional content underneath. The prosecutor asked Dr. Walsh to explain how a child could commit murder without experiencing remorse. Dr. Walsh began to describe the neurological research that suggested that children with callous unemotional traits had differences in the way their brains processed emotional information. Brain imaging studies showed that these children had reduced activation in the areas of the brain associated with emotional processing and empathy. They had reduced activity in the amygdala, the brain structure responsible for processing fear and emotional responses. They had reduced connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, the structures that normally work together to create moral decision-making. In other words, Jason's brain was literally different from the brains of most children. It was not damaged in the way that a traumatized brain might be damaged. It was organized differently from birth. It was organized in a way that made it possible for Jason to plan and execute a murder without the normal emotional barriers that would prevent such an act. The defense attorney stood for cross-examination, and she asked Dr. Walsh a series of questions designed to establish that these differences in brain structure were not necessarily permanent, that a 13-year-old's brain was still developing and could potentially change. Dr. Walsh agreed that adolescent brains continued to develop into the mid-20s. She agreed that neural plasticity, the ability of the brain to change and reorganize itself, was theoretically possible. But she also testified that research on children with callous unemotional traits showed that these traits were highly stable over time. Children who exhibited CU traits at age 10 typically still exhibited them at age 15, at age 20, at age 30. The traits did not disappear with age. They did not respond reliably to therapy or rehabilitation. They were, in many cases, a fundamental aspect of who the child was, not a phase they would grow out of or a problem that could be fixed with intervention. Judge Richardson leaned forward and asked Dr. Walsh a direct question. "In your professional opinion," the judge said, "is there any meaningful possibility that Jason Rivers could be rehabilitated through the juvenile justice system?" Dr. Walsh paused before answering. This was an important question because the entire purpose of the juvenile justice system was rehabilitation. If rehabilitation was not possible, then the argument for trying Jason as a juvenile fell apart. Dr. Walsh answered carefully. "Your Honor," she said, "rehabilitation is theoretically possible for any human being. But in my professional opinion, based on the evidence in this case, the likelihood of meaningful rehabilitation for Jason Rivers is extremely low. He shows no motivation to change. He shows no recognition of wrongdoing. He shows no empathy for his victim. In the absence of motivation, guilt, or empathy, the tools that we typically use to rehabilitate juvenile offenders, counseling, therapy, restorative justice programs, are unlikely to be effective. Jason Rivers does not believe he has done anything wrong. He does not believe he should feel remorse. Under those circumstances, rehabilitation becomes extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible." The gallery reacted to her testimony with a ripple of responses. Some people nodding, some people shifting uncomfortably, some people closing their eyes as if the reality of what was being said was too much to bear. Susan Chen, Marcus's mother, sat with her hands folded in her lap, and a single tear ran down her cheek. Not a tear of sadness, but a tear of something else, validation perhaps, or the understanding that the system was finally beginning to see what she had always understood. That the boy who had murdered her son was not capable of remorse, that he would never feel genuine guilt for what he had done, that punishment and rehabilitation might not be enough to protect society from him. The defense attorney continued her cross-examination, but the damage was done. Dr. Walsh's testimony had established something that the judge needed to understand, that Jason Rivers was not a normal juvenile offender, that he was not someone who could be rehabilitated through the standard mechanisms of the juvenile justice system. The prosecutor stood and asked one final question. "Dr. Walsh," the prosecutor said, "based on your evaluation of Jason Rivers and your knowledge of his behavior patterns, what is your assessment of the risk he poses to society if he is released back into the community?" "Dr. Stewart," Walsh answered without hesitation. "Hi," she said. "My assessment is that Jason Rivers poses a significant and continuing risk to the community. His lack of empathy, combined with his intelligence and his ability to manipulate others, suggests that he is likely to reoffend. The fact that he feels no remorse for this crime suggests that he sees no reason to change his behavior. If Jason Rivers is released, I would expect that he would pose a danger to others, potentially to multiple others, over the course of his life." The courtroom was completely silent. The judge made notes. The jury members looked at each other, and Jason Rivers, sitting at the defense table, showed no reaction whatsoever to the testimony that he was a danger to society, that he would likely kill again, that he was fundamentally incapable of change. He simply stared ahead, his expression blank, his mind apparently somewhere else entirely. Judge William Richardson sat alone in his chambers on the night of December 19th, long after the courthouse had closed for the day, long after the staff had gone home, long after the city outside his windows had quieted. On his desk in front of him was the case file for Jason Rivers, along with something else, a leather-bound notebook in which the judge had been writing his thoughts throughout the case. The notebook contained his reflections on the evidence, his considerations of the law, his wrestling with the moral questions that this case presented. He picked up the notebook and began to read what he had written over the past weeks. Early in the case, before he had fully understood what he was dealing with, he had written, "A child has killed another child. The law must decide what that means." Further down, after reviewing more evidence, he had written, "This is not a child who made a mistake. This is a person who chose to commit murder." And more recently, after Dr. Walsh's testimony, remorse requires the capacity to feel. This defendant appears to lack that capacity entirely. The judge thought about other cases he had presided over in his 23 years on the bench. He thought about a 16-year-old girl who had stolen a car and caused an accident that killed an innocent person. That girl had wept in his courtroom. That girl had expressed genuine remorse. That girl had begged for forgiveness and had committed herself to rehabilitation. The judge had sentenced her to 5 years in juvenile detention, with the understanding that she would likely be released at 21, that she would have a second chance at life, that the juvenile justice system existed for exactly her situation. He thought about a 14-year-old boy who had been involved in a gang altercation that had resulted in a stabbing death. That boy had been raised in poverty, in violence, in a neighborhood where survival sometimes meant making terrible choices. The judge had sentenced him to the juvenile system as well, understanding that his circumstances had contributed to his crime, that there were mitigating factors, that rehabilitation might be possible. But Jason Rivers was different from both of those cases. He was different in a fundamental way. The legal question was straightforward, at least in theory. Was Jason Rivers capable of being tried as an adult? The answer, based on the evidence presented, was clearly yes. He had understood the nature of his actions. He had understood that killing was wrong. He had understood the consequences. He had done it anyway. But the legal question was only the first question. The real question, the question that was keeping Judge Richardson awake at night, was a moral one. Should a 13-year-old be tried as an adult? Should a 13-year-old be sent to adult prison? Should a 13-year-old potentially spend the rest of his life in prison? These were questions that the law did not directly answer. These were questions that the judge had to answer himself, using his experience, his judgment, his understanding of justice. The judge walked to his window and looked out at the city at night. The streets were mostly empty. The buildings were dark. He thought about Marcus Chen. He thought about a child who would never grow up, never graduate high school, never go to college, never fall in love, never have children of his own. All of that had been taken from Marcus by another child. Judge Richardson returned to his desk and picked up the interrogation video transcript, the written record of Jason's interview with the detectives. He read through Jason's words, his lies, his evasions, his eventual admissions. He read the part where Jason had asked what would happen if he didn't talk to the detectives. He read the part where Jason had expressed curiosity about being charged as an adult, as if that was an interesting possibility rather than a catastrophic consequence. He read the part where Jason had laughed at the end of the interrogation. The judge understood that he was reading the words of someone who was fundamentally different from most 13-year-olds, someone who was intelligent, manipulative, and completely lacking in empathy. Someone who understood the world in terms of power and control rather than in terms of relationships and compassion. The judge understood that the juvenile justice system had been designed for children who were fundamentally salvageable, who had the capacity to change, who had the emotional foundation necessary for rehabilitation. But Jason Rivers appeared to lack that foundation. The judge pulled out a legal pad and began to write. He wrote about the purpose of the juvenile justice system: to rehabilitate, to provide a second chance, to recognize that children's brains were still developing and that they deserved the opportunity to change. He wrote about the purpose of the criminal justice system: to protect society, to provide proportional punishment, to hold people accountable for the harm they cause. He wrote about the question of where Jason Rivers belonged. He wrote about the concept of justice itself, about what society owed to its victims, about what it owed to its children, about how to balance competing interests and values. He wrote for hours, his pen moving across the page, his thoughts beginning to take shape and form. And then, sometime after midnight, he wrote a single sentence. He underlined it. He read it again. He understood that this one sentence would be the foundation of the ruling he would make. The sentence read, "A person who chooses to commit murder, who plans that murder, who executes it with calculation, and who feels no remorse for it, deserves to be held responsible as a person, not as a child." The judge set down his pen and looked at the sentence. He understood what that sentence meant. It meant that he was going to recommend that Jason Rivers be tried as an adult. It meant that he was going to allow the prosecution to pursue adult charges in adult criminal court. It meant that Jason Rivers could potentially face a life sentence, could potentially spend the rest of his life in prison. It meant that the judge was going to make a decision that would be historic, that would be controversial, that would be appealed and challenged and debated for years to come. But it also meant that the judge would be making a decision that reflected the reality of what Jason Rivers was. Not a child who could be rehabilitated, but a person who had chosen to commit murder and who should be held accountable for that choice. The judge looked at his notebook, at the sentence he had written, at the foundation of the ruling that would change juvenile justice in his state. History was being made in this moment, in this small chambers, in the late hours of the night, with no one watching except the judge and his conscience. The judge stood and walked to the window again. The sun was beginning to rise in the distance, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink. The night was ending. The day was beginning. In a few hours, the judge would return to the courthouse. In a few hours, the evidentiary hearing would continue. In a few hours, lawyers would argue about Jason Rivers' future, about the proper role of the juvenile justice system, about the meaning of accountability and responsibility. But the judge already knew what the outcome would be. He had made his decision. He had written it in his notebook. And when the time came to announce his ruling, the words would be ready. The reasoning would be clear. The foundation would be solid. The judge sat back down at his desk and waited for morning to come, for the machinery of justice to begin moving again, for the decision that he had made to be presented to the world. The courtroom on January 15th was packed to capacity and beyond. Extra chairs had been brought in. The gallery was standing room only. Media representatives filled every available space, cameras positioned to capture every angle. Outside the building, news vans lined the street. This was no longer just a local case. This had become a national story about a fundamental question. How should the justice system handle children who commit adult crimes? The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, charged with the understanding that something significant was about to happen. The judge's ruling on whether Jason Rivers should be tried as an adult in criminal court would set precedent. It would influence how similar cases were handled in the future. Every person in that room understood that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered, studied, and debated for years to come. Judge Richardson entered from his chambers wearing his black robe, his expression serious and composed. He took his seat at the bench and looked out at the assembled courtroom. His eyes moved across the gallery, past the reporters, past the community members, past the legal observers who had come from other states to witness this proceeding. His eyes found Marcus Chen's parents. Susan Chen sat with her hands in her lap, her face composed, but her eyes red from the tears she had shed over the past months. Her husband sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders. The judge looked at them for a moment, and something in his expression suggested that he saw them, that he understood their loss, that their pain was part of what had brought him to this moment. The judge then looked at Jason Rivers, who sat at the defense table in a suit that his parents had provided for the trial. The suit was well-tailored, expensive, clearly intended to make Jason look more mature, more sympathetic. But no suit could hide what was underneath. No clothing could cover the absence of emotion on his face. The judge began to speak, and his voice filled the courtroom with a quiet authority that commanded complete silence. This case, he said, presents the court with a question that is both legal and moral in nature. The question is whether a 13-year-old child who commits a deliberate, premeditated murder should be held accountable in the adult criminal justice system, or whether he should be protected by the juvenile justice system, which was designed to rehabilitate children and give them a second chance at life. I have reviewed all evidence in this case. I have heard testimony from expert witnesses. I have considered the arguments presented by both the prosecution and the defense. And I have concluded that there are certain acts, certain choices, that transcend age. There are certain actions that demand accountability, regardless of how old the person committing them happens to be. The judge paused and looked directly at Jason Rivers. The defendant in this case, he continued, deliberately planned the murder of Marcus Chen. He lured the victim to a secluded location. He executed his plan with calculation and intent. When confronted with his actions, he showed no remorse, no guilt, no empathy for the harm he caused. He laughed. Expert testimony has established that the defendant exhibits callous, unemotional traits that are highly stable and unlikely to respond to rehabilitation. The defendant does not believe he has done anything wrong. He does not believe he should feel remorse. He does not believe he should be punished. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the reporters, who had been trained to observe without showing emotion, seemed to be holding their breath. The juvenile justice system, the judge said, exists for children who have made mistakes, who have acted out of impulse, who have the capacity to grow, to change, to become different people than they are in their worst moments. The juvenile system recognizes that children's brains are still developing, that they may not fully understand the consequences of their actions, that they deserve a second chance. But that system cannot function when applied to a child who shows none of these characteristics. That system cannot rehabilitate someone who feels no guilt. That system cannot protect society from someone who understands exactly what he did and sees no reason to regret it. The judge's words were spoken with absolute clarity. With the weight of his 23 years of judicial experience behind them. "I am therefore ordering," the judge said, "that Jason Rivers be tried as an adult in the criminal court system of this state. He will be prosecuted under adult criminal law. If convicted, he will be subject to adult sentencing guidelines. The purpose of this order is not to punish a child, but to hold accountable a person who has committed a serious crime with full knowledge and understanding of what he was doing." The courtroom erupted. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Some people stood in shock. The defense attorney put her head in her hands. The prosecutor sat back in her chair, her expression showing the relief of someone whose argument had been validated. Jason Rivers showed almost no reaction. His expression remained blank. As if the judge's words meant nothing to him, as if being tried as an adult and potentially facing a life sentence was no more significant than being asked what he wanted for lunch. The judge continued, his voice rising slightly to be heard over the commotion in the courtroom. "This is a difficult ruling," he said. "It is a ruling that recognizes that not every child deserves to be treated as a child. It is a ruling that acknowledges that accountability must sometimes take precedence over age. It is a ruling that is made in recognition of the fact that Marcus Chen will never grow up, will never have the opportunities that Jason Rivers will have, will never have a future at all. The defendant took that future from him. The defendant must therefore face the consequences of that action as an adult." The judge's gavel came down, not 3 times in the traditional way, but once, a single definitive strike that echoed through the courtroom and seemed to reverberate through the entire building. The sound of that gavel striking was the sound of history being made, the sound of precedent being set, the sound of a decision that would change how the justice system handled similar cases in the future. Susan Chen closed her eyes, and tears began to flow down her face. Not tears of happiness exactly, but tears of validation, of acknowledgement, of the system finally understanding what her son's life had been worth. In the moments immediately after the judge's gavel fell, the courtroom descended into controlled chaos. Reporters rushed toward the exits, already calling their news desks, already composing the headlines that would lead the evening news. Camera flashes illuminated the courtroom like lightning strikes. Voices overlapped as people tried to process what they had just witnessed. But in the midst of all that noise and movement, there was one moment of profound quiet. Susan Chen sat in her seat with her eyes closed, tears streaming down her face, and her husband held her. He held her as if she might break. He held her as if his arms could somehow protect her from the reality of what had just been taken from them. When she finally opened her eyes and looked toward the bench where the judge had been sitting, her expression was one of exhaustion rather than triumph. The ruling was what she had wanted, what she had needed, what justice demanded. But it did not change the fundamental fact that her son was still dead, that no ruling could bring him back, that no courtroom decision could restore the future that had been stolen from him. The spectacle and noise began to fade as security officers began clearing the courtroom. People were ushered out by bailiffs. The media representatives were directed toward the courthouse steps, where they could hold their interviews and present their analyses. The families were led through corridors designed to allow them privacy, pathways that kept them away from the cameras and the questions. Marcus's parents were taken to a quiet room where victim advocates waited to provide support and to explain what would happen next. The trial phase would begin in a few weeks. The evidence would be presented again, this time in front of a jury in adult criminal court. The prosecution would argue for conviction and a substantial sentence. The defense would argue for leniency, for consideration of Jason's age, for some possibility of redemption. But everyone in that quiet room understood that the outcome was no longer truly in doubt. The judge's order to try Jason as an adult had already determined the basic framework of what would follow. Elsewhere in the courthouse, in a secure holding cell where Jason had been held during the proceedings, the boy sat alone. For the first time since his arrest, something appeared to be breaking through his carefully constructed emotional wall. He was crying, not dramatically, not with the kind of theatrical display that might be designed to manipulate observers, but quietly, alone, with no one watching. The guards who observed him through the cell window noted the tears, the slight shaking of his shoulders, the apparent crack in his composure. But the tears stopped after a few minutes. Jason wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and returned to his previous state of calm. He had been told that he would be transferred to an adult detention facility, that he would be held there pending trial, that he would be kept separate from the general population for his own safety. He had nodded when told these things. He had asked no questions. He had shown no emotion about his changed circumstances. Whatever had broken through for those few moments was gone now, replaced again by the familiar blankness. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy began in earnest. Camera crews set up on the courthouse steps. Reporters who had been waiting for hours finally had their story, the moment that would lead their broadcasts. The headlines that appeared on televisions and websites and newspaper front pages across the state were consistent in their theme. Judge makes historic decision. 13-year-old to be tried as adult for murder. Unprecedented ruling in juvenile justice case. State's toughest juvenile crime prosecution moves forward. The coverage was extensive and thorough. News programs brought in legal experts who explained the significance of the ruling. They discussed how this case might influence how other states handled similar situations. They debated whether the judge's decision was correct, whether it was too harsh, whether it represented a troubling erosion of protections for juvenile offenders. The discussion was nuanced and thoughtful, but it was also clear that the judge's ruling had resonated with the public. The vast majority of people who heard about the case supported the decision to try Jason as an adult. Legal scholars from universities across the country began publishing analyses of the ruling. Law review articles were written, examining the judge's reasoning, the precedent he had set, the implications for future cases. Some scholars criticized the ruling as too harsh, as a violation of the principle that children should be treated differently from adults, as a troubling sign of a society that was giving up on rehabilitation and embracing punishment instead. Other scholars praised the ruling as a necessary acknowledgment that some crimes were so serious, some perpetrators so dangerous, that age could not be the determining factor in how they were held accountable. The debate was conducted in the language of legal theory and constitutional law, but underneath it was a more fundamental question about what justice meant, about what society owed to its victims, about how to balance mercy with accountability. 3 months later, when the trial in adult criminal court concluded with a guilty verdict on charges of premeditated murder, the judge's original decision was vindicated. The jury had listened to the evidence, had heard the testimony, and had determined that Jason Rivers was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. At the sentencing hearing, the prosecution argued for life without the possibility of parole. The defense argued for a sentence that would at least theoretically allow for Jason's eventual release, maintaining that even a 13-year-old deserves some possibility of redemption. The judge, in a written decision that would become a landmark ruling in juvenile justice law, sentenced Jason Rivers to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge wrote that this sentence reflected both the seriousness of the crime and the particular characteristics of the defendant, his complete lack of remorse, his calculated planning, his demonstrated danger to society. The sentence meant that Jason Rivers would spend the rest of his life in prison. He would never be released. He would never walk free again. The community, in the weeks and months following the trial, began to move through a process of healing that was incomplete and would likely remain incomplete forever. The victim's family established a scholarship in Marcus's name, a fund that would provide educational opportunities to students who demonstrated the kind of kindness and integrity that Marcus had embodied. The school where both Marcus and Jason had been students implemented new protocols for identifying children who showed signs of serious behavioral problems, attempting to catch warning signs earlier so that interventions could be attempted. The courthouse, which had been the center of media attention for months, gradually returned to its normal operations, handling the ordinary cases that filled the dockets day after day. The judge returned to his chambers and continued the work of his position, knowing that the ruling he had made would follow him, would be cited in other cases, would influence how the system handled similar situations in the future. Years passed. Jason Rivers sat in a maximum security prison in a cell that measured 10 feet by 12 feet. He would spend the rest of his life in that cell, or cells like it, his future narrowed to a size so small that it was barely larger than a grave. The public moved on. The media coverage faded. The case that had dominated headlines for months became a reference point in legal discussions, a precedent cited in other cases, a moment in history that marked a change in how society understood accountability and childhood and the limits of rehabilitation. But for those who had been directly touched by this crime, the story did not fade. For Marcus's parents, for his sister Emma, For his extended family and friends, the loss remained present, a weight that they carried with them every day for the rest of their lives. And for the judge, the ruling he had made remained with him as well, not as a regret, but as a constant reminder of the power that his position held, the ability that he possessed to shape the future of a human being, the responsibility that came with that power. Judge Richardson gave an interview 5 years after the trial, the only extensive public statement he would make about the case. In that interview, he reflected on the decision he had made. He acknowledged that it had been difficult, that it had weighed on his conscience, that he understood the criticism that had come from people who believed the juvenile justice system should protect all children, regardless of what they had done. But he stood by his reasoning. He explained that justice was not about revenge. Justice was not about punishment for punishment's sake. Justice was about accountability, about ensuring that people understood the consequences of their choices, about protecting society from those who posed a genuine danger. He explained that he had made the decision not because Jason Rivers was a child, but because Jason Rivers was a person who had committed a serious crime with full knowledge and understanding of what he was doing. He explained that age could not erase the reality of what had happened, could not protect society from what Jason Rivers was capable of doing. In that same interview, the judge reflected on what he called the fundamental tragedy of the case. The tragedy was not simply that a child had been sentenced to life in prison, though that was tragic in its own way. The tragedy was that a 12-year-old boy, Marcus Chen, had been killed by someone his own age, someone he had trusted, someone who should have been his friend. The tragedy was that a family had been destroyed, that a mother had to live with the knowledge that her son's last moments had been filled with terror and pain. The tragedy was that a child had been born without the capacity to feel empathy, without the neural architecture that normally prevented humans from harming each other. Jason Rivers had not chosen to be born the way he was, but he had chosen to kill Marcus Chen. He had chosen to plan that murder. He had chosen to carry out that plan. And those choices had consequences that would echo through the rest of both their lives. One life ended, the other life confined to a prison cell. The judge's words from the sentencing became well known, quoted in legal textbooks, discussed in law school classes, analyzed in academic papers. The phrase, "a person who chooses to commit murder, who plans that murder, who executes it with calculation, and who feels no remorse for it, deserves to be held responsible as a person, not as a child," became a touchstone in debates about juvenile justice, a clear articulation of a principle that challenged the foundations of how the system had traditionally treated young offenders. Some people disagreed with those words. Some people believed that no child should ever be sentenced to life in prison, that society had a responsibility to leave open the possibility of redemption, that the judge had crossed a line that should never be crossed. But many more people found something in the judge's words that resonated with their own sense of justice, their own understanding that accountability had to mean something, that consequences had to be real. In the years following the trial, the school where Marcus had been a student installed a plaque in the hallway near the main office. The plaque bore Marcus's name and dates, October 3, 2008 to October 15, 2021. Below the dates was a single sentence that his parents had chosen. He was kind to everyone. That plaque became a place where students would pause, where new students would ask who Marcus was, where the story of what had happened would be retold year after year. The scholarship established in his name grew over time, and dozens of students received educational opportunities because of the kindness that Marcus had embodied. In that way, his memory lived on, his influence continuing to shape the world even after his death. His life had been stolen from him, but his legacy remained, a testament to the person he had been and the value that his parents placed on continuing his work of kindness in the world. The criminal justice system continued to evolve. Other cases arose where young offenders committed serious crimes, and in those cases, prosecutors pointed to the precedent that Judge Richardson had set. Not every case resulted in a child being tried as an adult. The judge's ruling did not change the entire system overnight. But it had opened the door to the possibility. It had established that age alone could not be a shield against accountability. It had created a framework for considering factors like premeditation, planning, and lack of remorse when deciding how to prosecute young offenders. The ruling was appealed multiple times, but the appellate courts upheld the judge's decision. It became settled law that certain crimes, committed in certain ways by certain perpetrators, could justify trying juveniles as adults, even when those juveniles were very young. Years became decades. Judge Richardson eventually retired from the bench. He spent his final years writing, reflecting on his career, on the cases that had mattered most, on the decisions that had shaped not just individual lives, but the broader society. When people asked him about the Jason Rivers case, he would pause before answering. He would think about Marcus Chen. He would think about the porch light that had burned, waiting for a child who would never come home. He would think about accountability and mercy, about justice and revenge, about the difficult line between them. And then he would say simply, "I made the decision I had to make." History will judge whether it was the right one. The porch light at the Chen family home eventually burned out, and it was never replaced. The house where Marcus had grown up was eventually sold to another family, who knew nothing of the tragedy that had occurred in that neighborhood. But in the hearts and minds of those who had known Marcus, who had loved Marcus, the light remained eternal, a beacon of memory, a reminder of a life cut short, a testament to a boy who had been kind to everyone and whose absence would be felt forever. Justice had been served. But no serving of justice could bring Marcus home. No sentence could restore what had been lost. The only thing that remained was the memory of a child who had mattered, who had been loved, who had deserved a future that was stolen from him by another child who felt nothing at all. And the understanding, hard-won and bitter, that sometimes justice meant acknowledging that not everything could be made right, that some losses were permanent, and that accountability, while necessary, could never be enough.